What's up, guys? This is Taking the Field with Stevie Mac. It's good to be back. You guys asked for me to bring the show back a few days ago. I was happy to do that for you. Really excited to be back here bringing you all things PLL here this summer in 2023. I want to be a little bit timely here. We got a lot to get to in segment 3, as always, getting your thoughts, your comments in the mix. So I want to be as timely as possible as I can to make sure that I get to all of those. We'll get into some PLL fantasy and PLL betting in a little bit. But to start things out, I kind of want to quickly recap some of my thoughts, some of the things that I saw, just some quick hitting points from week 1 of that PLL action last weekend out in Albany. Starting out with the Redwoods and the Atlas, I mean, that was just a tough one for the Atlas. They trailed pretty much from start to finish in that game. The offense, I think, a few times looked a little bit confused. You saw guys on the replay on ABC, guys kind of running to the same spot on the field looking for a pass, so not sure that they were totally on the same page offensively. Now, obviously, a new head coach there in Mike Pressler leading the way, possibly a slightly newer system than what they were used to running in the past with Stephen Brooks as the offensive coordinator. So, I mean, it is week 1. You don't expect it to look perfect. There are going to be some of those mistakes that they can iron out now that they have those things on film. But again, I think that it was just a tough one overall for the Atlas. Like I said, pretty much trailing from start to finish. But Rob Pennell was the Woods quarterback at X, just like I said he would be in my preseason MVP article. If you haven't had a chance to check that out just yet, you can go ahead. That's over on Lacrosse Playground. You can check that out for my article there. And I think that the Atlas really have a tough turnaround now playing the Whipsnakes in week 2. And we also saw the Cade Van Raphorst news of him getting released by the Atlas. I'll get into that a little bit more in segment 3. You guys asked for my thoughts on that, so I'll touch more on that specifically in segment 3. Game number 2 of the weekend was the Cannons and the Archers. The Archers still look very good offensively, even after losing 2 of their better players in Will Manny and Marcus Holman. They did bring over Mac O'Keefe in free agency, and he had 3 goals on 11 shots in week 1. Mike Sisselberger was another bright spot for that Archers club in week 1, going 24 of 30, which is good for 80% at the stripe. I mean, that's just ridiculous in itself. Then he adds 14 ground balls, a goal, and an assist to his night. And the Cannons, I think, will be better this year. Does that mean playoffs better? I don't know. Obviously, it's only been 1 week, so it's way too early to tell. But I do think they'll be better. And again, same with the Cade Van Raphorst story. I've got more on the Cannons later on in segment 3. The third game and the first game of that second day of the weekend was the Chaos and the Water Dogs. The goalies, I think, were a big story in this game, a very low-scoring affair between the Chaos and the Water Dogs. Blaze went 72%, making 18 saves on the day, while Matt DeLuca at the other end had a pretty solid afternoon himself, had 10 saves, good for 59%, getting the win there. Connor Kelly led the Water Dogs with 3 points, including a 2-pointer and the overtime game winner in that one. And I think the Chaos most notably will benefit from getting their NLL guys back here in week 2. But one thing that did stand out to me about their game in week 1 was Nick Rowlett was a big bright spot for them, going 13 of 18 at the stripe with 7 ground balls in his debut, a rookie out of Michigan. And then the final game of week 1 was the Whipsnakes and the Chrome. This was the third and final 1-goal game of the weekend. A lot of parity, I guess you would say, across the league. Some very closely contested matchups all weekend long. And it really felt like the Chrome beat the Whipsnakes at their own game in this one by winning a close game right at the buzzer, thanks to Cross Ferrara's last-second effort, finishing with 2 goals and 2 assists, including the game-winning goal with about 2 seconds left in that one. So like I said, kind of almost beating the Whipsnakes at their own game. We've seen some of their late-game heroics in the past, whether it be guys like Matt Rambo, Brad Smith, I think, has buried a pretty late goal before. I know Jay Carlson, now retired, but Jay Carlson in the past had buried one as well. But Petey LaSala for the Whipsnakes and Tucker Dordovic had 2 really solid outings in their pro debuts in that one. LaSala went 13 of 24 with 6 ground balls, while Dordovic had 2 goals and 1 assist on a team-high 13 shots in the loss against the Chrome. So coming up here in just a moment in segment 2, I've got some PLL fantasy and PLL betting for you here heading into week 2 of PLL action. Then we'll wrap things up just how I always like to do. We'll get your thoughts and your comments in the mix as well. But you're listening to Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. All right, welcome back. Taking the Field with Stevie Mack, segment 2 on a Thursday leading into week 2 of PLL action here this summer. Got some PLL fantasy and PLL betting for you here in segment 2 to kind of go through my lineup here for week 2 in PLL action. At attack, I've got Jeff Teat, which is a 48 cap hit, and Michael Sowers, good for a 9 cap hit. Real quick, if you're new to PLL fantasy here this season, last year they did sort of a tiers list where you had tiers 1, 2, and 3, and you picked a certain amount of players from each tier. This year they did it more where it's a sort of salary cap, if you will. So that's something to note from one year to the other, kind of a major difference, a major shakeup, if you will, in PLL fantasy. So Jeff Teat, you do get about 200, I think is what it was, 200 cap points that you get to play with in PLL fantasy this year. So Jeff Teat accounts for about 48 of those points. Michael Sowers was only 9 due to the fact that he was kind of a non-factor, and I'll talk about that more when I kind of explain my lineup more fully in just a moment, but he was kind of a non-factor in week 1, which is why his cap hit was so low in week 2. My midfielders are Brian Costabile, who was a 21 cap hit, and Jackson Morrill was a 48. Both those guys actually played pretty well back in week 1, which is why they kind of sit where they do. But again, I'll explain a little bit more in just a moment. Defense, I have Michael Earhart, who was a 22 cap hit. My goalie is Sean Scanoni at 32, and my faceoff was TD Erlin at 20. So like I said, kind of just breaking this down a little bit further, Jeff Teat had 1 goal and 4 assists last week to go with just 1 turnover on the day. That's why he's as high up on that attack list as he is. I believe he was the number 2 attackman on the list to just Ryder Gardensey, who absolutely balled out in week 1 with those 6 or 7 goals, I forget what it was, against the Atlas in that win. And like I said, Michael Sowers was basically non-existent in that week 1 matchup with the Chaos, which is why his cap hit was as low as it was. I'm kind of betting here that it won't be that same scenario 2 weekends in a row. So I would imagine that, or I would at least hope that he'll be better than he was a week ago. Costabile and Morrill combined for 3 goals and 4 assists, 5 ground balls in week 1. So again, kind of putting those two together in the same fantasy lineup. You're hoping for sort of that similar production again here in week 2. And Michael Earhart simply is one of the best in the world at his position. A week ago, he had 1 caused turnover and 7 ground balls. Sean Scanoni made 14 saves in week 1. Probably has to be around that number again here in week 2, going up against the Archers. And in week 1, Nick Rowlett dominated against Zach Tucci, and this week Tucci gets TD Erlin, so give me TD Erlin all day in that matchup. So again, that's my lineup. I've got Jeff Teat, Michael Sowers, Brian Costabile, Jackson Morrill, Michael Earhart, Sean Scanoni, and TD Erlin rounding things out. But to get to a little bit of PLL betting here in segment 2, again, we'll get your thoughts, your comments in the mix in a little bit in segment 3. But to get a little PLL betting in the mix here very quickly, the Chrome and the Archers will kick things off here in week 2. They're both kind of splitting right now at -115. So I'm looking at a player prop here in this game. One that I really like was Justin Anderson over 2.5 points. This is on DraftKings, by the way. DraftKings over 2.5 points at +130. He had 4 points back in week 1. So I think that's a pretty decent play here for the Chrome and the Archers. And also the other thing that DraftKings does do, especially this year, I don't believe they did it last year with the PLL, but this year I did notice in week 1 they had live betting odds and live lines for you to play around with there. So if you don't like one of these lines here pregame. You can always do something in-game, maybe see how things play out as the game progresses, and then if you see something you like, you can jump on it then. But like I said, at least pregame, I like Justin Anderson over 2.5 points at plus 130. For the Water Dogs and Redwoods, the Water Dogs are the favorite at minus 130. The matchup to watch, as I kind of mentioned with my fantasy lineup, the matchup to watch here, I think, is Tucci against TD Erlin. Tucci went just 4 of 14 against Nick Rowlett in week 1, and I think if the Woods can win at the stripe, they can definitely have a good opportunity to win this game. So give me the Redwoods plus 100 in this one. The Whipsnakes and the Atlas are favored minus 125. The Whipsnakes, I believe it said, were minus 105, so not a whole lot of difference there between the two. But I'll actually take the Whipsnakes plus 1.5, as they always seem to kind of keep things close no matter who they're playing, whether they win or lose. It's always this close, really exciting, down to the last minute, who has the ball last type of game. And that's even something that we saw in week 1 with them against the Chrome. So I think that this could be kind of gearing up to be another one of those games here in week 2. And then the final game, the Chaos and the Cannons. The Chaos are the favorite at minus 130 as they get pretty much all of their NLL guys back here in week 2, which really benefits their offense. You talk about guys like Dane Smith and Josh Byrne, just to name a few. But I like Matt Campbell on the other side for the Cannons. I like Matt Campbell over 1.5 points after having 2 points a week ago. I think the Chaos will really try to limit the impact of guys like Asher Nolting and Marcus Holman within that Cannons offense, which means that sort of secondary options like Campbell could get a lot more touches here in week 2. So I like him over 1.5 points against the Chaos. But to round things out here on a Thursday heading in to week 2 of PLL action, we'll get to your thoughts, your comments next on Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. All right, welcome back. Third and final segment of the show leading into week 2 in the PLL here on Taking the Field with Stevie Mack, getting your thoughts and your comments here in the mix. Like I said, I wanted to be timely with that first part of the episode. I wanted to make sure that I was able to get to all your comments and questions here in segment 3. So to start us off, Mark on Twitter at Stevie Mac Media is my Twitter handle. You can hit me up there for all show related topics and discussion. But Mark says, thoughts on Lyle skipping the PLL for the MSL? Is Dane Smith the best player in lacrosse right now? Cities and regions likely to get a team? Paul said some team names could change, and which team names need to change? Is professional lacrosse slowly morphing into sixes? So a lot there from Mark. Obviously, thanks for your questions, and I'll try to hit each one of these sort of individually here. But thoughts on Lyle skipping the PLL for the MSL? This is something that, going back to segment 1 at the top of the show, I said I had something with the Cannons that I wanted to get into. I think this comment sort of fits perfectly to lead us off, which allows me to get into that. But I think, obviously, first and foremost, Lyle doing that is what he felt like was the best decision for him at this time, kind of stepping away from the PLL and doing something that I think he felt was something that was more important to him at this time. He mentioned wanting to spend more time with his family and be a part of his community. So if this is what allows him the opportunity to do that while still being able to play at a high level, then, you know, all the props in the world to him. Hopefully he has a good summer in doing so. But as far as what it means for the Cannons, I think that it forces them now to have to get more people involved. I think at times last year and even the year before, something that you saw with that offense was it started to resemble a little bit of a men's league team where you kind of just get it to your best attackman and then everybody gets out of his way and lets him go to work. Whereas now, because you don't have him to fall back on, you don't have that sort of crutch to fall back on, now you have to get guys like Marcus Holman involved in the offense. You have to make Asher Nolting a bigger part of the offense. You have to get Ryan Drenner, Matt Campbell, and those sorts of guys more involved in the offensive game plan and get them more touches, because you're not necessarily going to replace the kind of production that a Lyle Thompson gives you. I don't think that that's very fair to expect a lot of those guys to be able to do that. So statistically, I don't know if this offense will be better without him, but I think at least by the eye test, it'll look better, because you can't just have the ball get stuck in his cross for half a possession like it seemed like they did in past years. Now you do have to have some sort of off-ball movement. You do have to get other people involved. He says, is Dane Smith the best player in lacrosse right now? Well, I certainly think coming off a MVP season in the NLL, it's very easy to say so, especially considering that depending on the kind of summer he has here in the PLL, it's very possible that if the Chaos make the postseason and they at least win a game in the postseason, I think it's very possible that he has an MVP season in the PLL as well. And if he does that, then yes, I absolutely do think that, especially with the absence of a guy like Lyle Thompson, you could then make the case that Dane Smith becomes one of, if not the best player in pro lacrosse right now. He says cities and regions likely to get a team. I mean, let's just get this out of the way right now. They're going to pack teams in to the eastern part of the country, whether it be, New York, Pennsylvania, somewhere down in the Maryland, Virginia area, somewhere around those areas. But I do think they'll put a team in the Midwest. They'll put a team out west. Where those will be, I have no idea. If you've seen the list of possible cities or regions that they're considering that the fans can vote on, the list is pretty long. It's pretty significant. So they could go to any number of places. But I will say, at least here in the Midwest, I am a fan of possibly putting a team in either Chicago or Columbus. One that I thought was interesting. It'll never happen, but I mean, hey, a guy can dream, right? But as a Michigander, one that I thought was interesting was one of the quote unquote regions that you could pick from was the Great Lakes. And I quite honestly said, hey, I'll vote for either Columbus or Chicago, but if you put the Great Lakes team in Michigan, that's the direction I'm going all day. But like I said, probably not going to happen, but a guy can dream. He says, Paul said some of the teams' names could change. Which team names need to change? I got to be honest, and this might be an unpopular opinion, I'm not really a fan of chaos. I think once you go city or region-based, whatever the case may be, I'm not so sure that one really has kind of a tie-in anywhere, because you talk about some of these teams, like maybe the Atlas could be down in like the Southwest or something, like down in Texas, or the Chrome could be in like Michigan or Ohio, somewhere where there's, cars and things like that, like manufacturing. You start to kind of get those attachments to those cities or regions. And I don't think a team like the Chaos, again, maybe unpopular opinion, but I don't think the Chaos really has that sort of tie. The Water Dogs could be another interesting one. I do think they might hold on to the Water Dogs just because they're technically one of the newer teams. But then again, also, now that I think about it, maybe that could mean that they're one of the teams that gets their name changed because they're sort of one of the newer teams in the league. But again, I don't know if Water Dogs is necessarily one of those teams that could keep their name going forward. So I don't know. It's definitely an interesting question. And I think we'll have to wait and see where some of these cities are or the regions are that do get picked and kind of go from there. Because that's one thing. I think it was on State of the League in week 1 where Paul told Paul Carcaterra that, it's going to kind of be a process. It's not going to be a sprint. It's going to be sort of more of a marathon. We're going to kind of take it one thing at a time, and then as we sort of check different things off the checklist, then we'll kind of reassess where we're at and see how we can best move forward. So I do think that, at least off the top of my head, Chaos is probably a big one, that going towards that city or region based model, that I could see them sort of getting a rebrand. And he says, is professional lacrosse slowly morphing into sixes? I don't know if it's necessarily going that way, but I think that they saw the success that something like the championship series back in February had, and they're trying to now take sort of the best of that model and the best of the more traditional outdoor model and kind of blending the two. So is it slowly morphing into it? it's possible. I think that shorter shot clock that they've introduced this season definitely does sort of lend itself to that style of play. You saw some longer outlet passes from the goalies because now you do have to push a little bit more in transition. And I think it's also sort of affecting the way that some of these teams sub on and off the field as well. So I think the more that we see it throughout this summer, the more we'll get accustomed to it. And I think the same goes for the teams on the field. The more that they play under those new shot clock rules, I think the more comfortable that they will get with it. So is professional lacrosse slowly morphing into sixes? I don't know if it's morphing into it, but I think it's more so just adopting some of the things from sixes that work best and can be applied to the professional field game. From Chromeback 2023 on Twitter, he says, I noticed the extreme parity in the league and so many close games across the board. The level of talent on the field is absurd, and there's enough talent in the player pool for more teams. New additions having an immediate impact on their teams is another theme. Yeah, a lot of rookies and a lot of guys that switch teams in free agency, a lot of those guys did have some significant impacts in week one with their clubs. You talk about Marcus Holman had a pretty solid week one with his new team playing for his dad on the Cannons. Cross Ferrara got the game winner, had those 2 goals, 2 assists in the game against the Whipsnakes. We already talked about a guy like Nick Rowlett, Petey LaSala. Those guys had pretty solid debuts at the stripe. And I mean, the list goes on and on. Xander Dixon had a pretty decent week one with the Atlas, even in the loss to the Redwoods. So yeah, a lot of those new guys, whether it be rookies or whether it be guys that switch teams in free agency, a lot of those guys did have big impacts on their clubs. He says, I noticed the extreme parity in the league. Yeah, 3 of the first 4 games of the regular season were 1-goal games. The only one that wasn't was that Cannons and Archers game, that was 16-13, I believe, was the final in that one. So yeah, a lot of parity already straight off the bat in week one. And he says the level of talent on the field is absurd, and there's enough talent in the player pool for more teams. Yeah, and I think that's where you get guys like Cade Van Raphorst being let go to the player pools, because these teams are so competitive and these players are so good that not even just year to year now, but you're even seeing it week to week. There could be guys that are in the lineup one week that aren't even on the 19-man roster the following week. So it's so tough, not even, like I said, not even just year to year, but even week to week now in the PLL. But I think moving forward, that's going to be a great thing for the sport, because week in and week out, you are getting the 19 best players on that team for that given week. From Michael Ramirez, he said, thoughts on Atlas taking 2 polls in the first round and Cade Van Raphorst being the odd man out. Yeah, I think we saw that kind of writing on the wall when they took those 2 polls, number 1 and number 3 overall being Adler and Makar. I think a lot of people, especially on Discord in the Atlas fan group, I think a lot of people thought that odd man out was going to be Michael Rexroad in the long run. I don't think any of us would have really picked that it would have been Cade Van Raphorst. But just like I said in that last comment, not even year to year, but week to week, these lineups can change a lot from week to week, depending on certain matchups and different things like that. But I think for him to be cut just outright the way that he was, I think that it's not as shocking, though, when you think about it, even from an Atlas fan's perspective. You go back to when Ben Rubior took over, he kind of had that half a year in 2020, that championship series year, where it was more about just playing out that season, then assessing the roster from there. And you saw what he did that offseason. He traded Rob Pennell. He traded Ryan Brown. He traded Paul Rabel. He let go of Connor Busick. Like, he made quite a few moves, letting go of some big name guys. And maybe for Pressler, this was that move for him, where Cade Van Raphorst has been around the league basically from year one. He's been a solid defender, a plus defender every single year that he's been in the league. He's been a ground ball machine year in and year out. But maybe he came in and said, hey, I'm going to do things my way. Ben Rubior did things his way. This is my team now. This is my roster. And you took those 2 guys. You took Adler and Makar for a reason. You picked them so that you could play them. And if if moving on from Cade Van Raphorst, who, by the way, was only on a 1-year deal through this summer, if making that move now versus waiting till the end of the year into the offseason, if making that move allowed you to play Adler and Makar more, then I think you had to make that move now versus waiting till the offseason. And the other thing that it did too, let's not forget this, because I feel like this kind of went under the radar because of the news of them releasing Cade Van Raphorst, was that it also allowed them to pick up Steven Rafis from the player pool, who was let go, I believe the day before, or maybe it was the same day, by the Cannons. So if it allowed them to have an excuse to play Adler and Makar more, and you add some midfield depth in Steven Rafis, then I think it makes a lot of sense. You know, it may not have made sense at the moment when you first saw it, but I think when you really sit there and think about it, it does make some sense. And then finally from Coach Streck, he says, can the Cannons find success without Lyle and make the playoffs? Can Sisselberger keep pace at faceoff X going up against quality faceoff guys? And can he win Rookie of the Year? So to address his first comment about the Cannons, I've kind of already touched on it here in this episode. Can the Cannons find success without Lyle and make the playoffs? I don't know if they'll make the playoffs, but I do think that they will be better than what we've seen in the past. Now, record-wise, it's kind of hard to do worse than what they've done in the past. I think they're currently win total odds is 3.5. So will they get up over 3.5? I think it's definitely possible. I think there's going to be a lot of parity in this league this year. So I think on any given day, any one of these teams can beat any one of the other clubs. So yeah, I do think that they can at least be better than what we've seen in the past. And like I said a little bit ago, I think that the offense, maybe not statistically, maybe not on paper, but I think by the eye test, this offense will be better because they're going to be forced to have to get everybody else involved. It's not just going to be the Lyle Thompson show anymore because he's not there. So you have to get guys like Holman, like Drenner, like Nolting, like Matt Campbell, those guys involved and a bigger part of this offense going forward. He says, can Sisselberger keep pace at faceoff X going up against quality faceoff guys? Yeah, I mean, he had an unbelievable week 1. Is that sustainable for an entire 10-game regular season? I don't think so. We've only really seen it, and not even to that level, but we've only seen performances like that for an entire season 1 or 2 times. I know we saw it from Trevor Baptiste in the past a few years ago, and we saw it from Joe Nardella the year prior to that. So we have seen performances where faceoff guys have made major impacts on their club. Trevor Baptiste winning the MVP last season, of course. But do I think he can go 80% for an entire season? I highly doubt it, but I do think that he is going to be a major storyline for the Archers throughout this summer. And he says, can he win Rookie of the Year? Yeah, I think if he even has half the season the rest of the way as he did in week 1, I do think that puts him in the race for Rookie of the Year. But again, it's so hard, I feel like, especially at the face-off position, to have that kind of performance week in and week out. I mean, forget what he did just at the stripe. He also had those 14 ground balls. He had a goal and an assist, So again, like I said, keeping up that kind of pace for an entire season, not something that I would really expect from him, let alone anybody else in the league. And again, you're talking about some of the best players in the world at that position. So can he win Rookie of the Year? Yeah, I absolutely think he can. But again, it's only been 1 week, probably a little bit too early to tell. You can ask me again, and I'm sure you will ask me again in a couple of weeks. But that'll do it for this episode of Taking the Field with Stevie Mack. Again, good to be back. I'm glad that you guys asked me to bring the show back, and there was a lot of interest in bringing the show back, so I was more than happy to do that for you. But you can check out the podcast basically anywhere you get your podcasts, including Google, Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Stitcher, just to name a few. But that'll do it for me. I'll talk to you guys later.